macroeconomic model that we used in the paper. And to do that, I have the person who put the model together, filled in all the details, Mr. Scotland's sectorial balances, Kieran McKenna. Hi, Kieran. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hello, William. That was a very generous introduction.
We acknowledged you in the paper and said you did make our life so much easier by taking on a lot of the heavy lifting with this. And this is right where you're trying to finish your Masters of Economics of Sustainability at Torrance University. So again, thanks so much for doing this. I know it was a big chunk of work. Now I'm going to lean heavily on you tonight as you talk us through the model. I know there's a few people who are joining who have looked at the model. If there's any real technical questions that we need to get into the detail, I'll just get back to you later, because I want this to be an introductory session showing people what the model was, how we put it together, the three scenarios, and also, I think really importantly, how they can use this model and start to imagine what an independent Scotland would be like, looking at some of the variables that we can change within the model. So hopefully you'll get a lot out of it. You might want to come back to it a couple of times if you are using the model. But Kieran, let's get going. I'll bring the Excel sheet that the model's based on the screen. Okay. And if you want to just start taking us through, just very briefly, we had three scenarios in the paper. We had a best case scenario of 1.4% GDP growth, and this was based on the highest period of realistic growth that we could find for Scotland, which was average between 2009 and 2019, which is 1.4%. And then the second scenario was 1%, which you and I felt was still fairly optimistic, but was kind of like a mid-range one. And then the third scenario, which I think is going to be much closer to where we actually end up this year, which was stagnant growth, 0% growth. So we had three scenarios in the paper, and we showed you the impact of moving to the Stability and Growth Pact based on these three different growth rates. And we're going to use scenario one to talk through how we use the model, which is what we've got on screen right now.
Yeah. So I think the first thing to say is it can be quite overwhelming looking at everything. So we'll go through it as slow as possible. But it's important to know that the forecasted sectorial balances are all based on a foundational year. So in our model, it's 2023 right here, which is we decided to include offshore activity, and the most up-to-date GDP data for offshore activity is from 2023. We do have data for the onshore economy for 2024, but nothing for the offshore economy. So right now, our baseline year is 2023, and the GDP for Scotland, including the offshore activity for 2023, was 217 billion. And if you keep scrolling along row 2, you'll see how we get to this 217 billion GDP, which is consumption, 127 billion. And then we have government spending, which according to the Scottish National Accounts for the Scottish economy was 54 billion. Exports at 122 billion and imports of 127 billion, and investment of 42 billion, and that's where you get the 217 billion right here at the start.
Yeah, and important to say that is as you said, that's the offshore figure that includes our earnings from oil and gas. And when you look at GERS and also a lot of the GDP calculations for Scotland, it doesn't include that earning or the earnings from the fossil fuels, oil and gas sector. And when we were putting this together, we just felt that we had to give a truer representation of the economy by using the offshore figures. Now that certainly made things much more complicated for us, didn't it? Because figures are not as readily available as the onshore ones, but we think we had to go with that slightly bigger figure. And again, if you look at what we're trying to do within the paper, we're trying to be as optimistic as possible. So we're talking about GDP higher than the onshore number, but we still think that's a fairer reflection of where we are.
And it's a more than fair thing to do. I mean, I think Scotland's maybe the only economy that separates their onshore and offshore activity. Norway doesn't produce a GDP without oil, so it's just a peculiar thing to do.
It is a very peculiar thing to do.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's how we make up the GDP figure. So we know the GDP, we've got that from the Scottish accounts, and we separate it out as best we can using the figures that we've got to say this is how that figure's made up.
Yes, exactly. And I'll just touch on two more columns here, which are transfers from the government. And we felt this was important to include because the government column, you might have noticed it was only 54 billion, which sounds quite low, compared to the figure that is given for total government expenditure in GERS. But when you're calculating GDP, you only calculate the government expenditure and goods and services within the economy, not transfers to people, to citizens. So this transfers column adds to the government expenditure within our model, and it's the 27 billion you get from adding social security payments and interest on the national debt.
Okay, it's worth just highlighting there that these figures are included. They're just in the other part of the sectorial balances frame. They're counted as private sector income rather than government expenditure, because you can't have them in two places when you look at the financial transactions. So you have to put all of the expenditure in one of these columns. And what you've said is we just looked at government expenditure. We took out the transfers because that directly goes to the private sector, and we separated that, but they're still all included within the figure for GDP.
That's correct, yes. And the net income flows, again, the trade balance, the exports and imports is only for trade in goods and services. And as we know, Scottish economy has a lot of foreign ownership in the private sector, and so a lot of money flows out of Scotland every year. And so we had to add a net income flows column, and this 11.5 billion number is the average net income flow from 1999 to 2021.
And like I said, because we didn't have, the Scottish government haven't released the figures for the last 4 years. So there's a wonderful publication from the chief economist who only takes us up to 2021, and that goes all the way back to 1998. So we just had to say, we don't know what that figure is, but we need to come up with a figure that we can be confident to say this is likely or roundabout to be. And as you said, we looked at the average over that period of time to come up with that figure. And again, it's really important because that gives you a much bigger picture when we move to sectorial balances of how the income, how the financial wealth is spread across the three sectors: the government sector, the private sector, and the foreign sector. So you won't see this in anyone else's calculations of the sectorial balances for Scotland. So we took a lot of time and effort to make sure that we included this to give a fairer picture.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's the base year that the model is based on. Now, as we slowly go along, you wouldn't really change anything in here. These are all modern decisions that we've made. What you can change is if you scroll right along to the growth rates for the GDP variables, which are all in these yellow columns here. And we're in scenario 1, which, as William mentioned at the beginning, is 1.4%. So you would input this as 1.014. And again, the 1.4% is the average GDP growth rate for Scotland from 2009 to 2019. So these growth, the investment, exports, government, imports and consumption wouldn't all be growing at 1.4%, but together within GDP, the total growth rate was 1.4%.
Right. So growth was 1.4, but what you're saying is export growth could have been 0.7 and government growth could have been 3.2, but it averaged out at the GDP growth of 1.4, which gives us the scenario.
Precisely, yeah. And we just done this to kind of try to get some sort of constant and reliable sectorial balances, but the audience could get as creative as they want within realistic means. Right now, when you change these growth rates, which we might do, which we'll play around with in a minute, but these growth rates are all determining the balances at the beginning of the model, which, as you can see here, this is the GDP column. So this is GDP growing each year, and you see that it kind of balances out to around 1.5%. getting lower as we get down into 2041. The government deficit.
So the Y is the growth. That's GDP growth, isn't it?
Yes, the green column is GDP growth, and the column B is GDP in nominal terms. And this column here, T minus G, is taxes minus government spending. So this would be the deficit. It has a minus number. So the first year of our scenario, around £30 billion deficit, and that continues to grow. But it merges out because GDP is also growing. It balances out to around 12%.
Okay.
This column is investment minus savings column. So again, the nominal number is 13.8 billion. This is a private sector balance. So 13.8 billion private sector surplus, and that starts at 6% of GDP. It stays around 13 billion, but goes round to 5% of GDP. And the foreign sector balance, so this is the difference between exports and imports, and our foreign sector has a surplus.
And foreign revenue and foreign,
including the net income flows.
Yep.
So this balances out to around 7.5%. And if we scroll down, right underneath all these balances is the sectorial balance graph, where you can see the foreign sector surplus is in green, the private sector surplus is in blue, and this is the government deficit, the public sector deficit in red. And you can see, like, because we've set the growth rates all at 1.4%, it's a pretty smooth sectorial balance. If you were to get creative and change the growth rates between all the variables, you could get fluctuating balances, like you would see
in the actual balances right now.
Like you see, the historical sectorial balances, which you've shared many times, William. You see the green and the blue and the red. Well, the green actually stays pretty consistent, but the blue and the red fluctuate based on the public and private sector balances. So if you got more creative with the growth rates, you could forecast sectorial balances like
brilliant. So as we said, this is fairly simple because we wanted really to show very clearly that if Scotland was independent and the economy grew as well as it could, or as well as you would expect it to, and we wanted the private sector to save, which is the blue bit, which is a good thing, considering that we've got a foreign sector, there's a foreign sector surplus here. There has to be a public sector deficit to give the foreign, as plainly as I can say, we need a private sector deficit to allow us to save, and also for us to pay for our imports, and also for money to go back to the foreign sector. This is what we said. This is where you are. But if you go into those, if you scroll up and go over to those variables that you can change, and this is where I think we were speaking earlier, and you said actually what we've done, there's no way that this would be the case. It's likely that if the government reduced its spending, it wouldn't just reduce it to 1% of GDP, because actually some of that spending would be seen in a reduction in the private sector and might be seen as an increase in the foreign sector. So kept it at 1.4 just purely for simplicity, to get an idea of where we would be. But yeah, I think it would be really good for people to look at that. And then the final thing I want to say before we move on to the other scenarios, could you go back, just scroll down to the sectorial balances as they are. It's really important that we make the point that if Scotland was independent, these sectorial balances, certainly from an MMT perspective, would be absolutely fine. No problem at all. What we've got here is the private sector saving every year, increasing its net financial wealth, us getting a little bit wealthier every year, making sure that we've got no debt stress and that we're never worried about being over indebted. Perfect. We've got some exports. That's fine. If people want to give us their goods in exchange for Scottish currency, that's fine. If the government runs a 12% deficit every year to fill and react to what the private sector and the foreign sector are doing, absolutely fine, absolutely no problem at all. And I think it's really important, because if you don't understand this, you could think that we are saying, oh no, Scotland can't survive as an independent nation because it's got this massive public deficit. And that's completely not what we're saying. We're just showing how the financial flows are modelled over a period of time, and it's normal for governments to have deficits. This is what Scotland's nominal deficit is at the moment. It's not that much lower, 3 or 4 percentage points above a country like America. It's not completely unreal to think that this wouldn't be a great working position for Scotland. So I think that's a really important point to make.
Absolutely. And I think the good thing about this model for our audience, if and when they're using it, is when you click on the columns, you will see, if I was to click on the private sector balance here, you see up in this where you can edit the columns, you can see how we get to this private sector balance. And it's obviously all coded right now, AN3 minus BP3, but this is essentially savings minus investment, which is the debt that the private sector's taken on. So the private sector savings minus the debt that they're taking on, plus transfers from the government, which is social security payments, interest on national debt, minus net income flows, which is the money flown out of Scotland to the rest of the world. So we can see here, these are the variables which influence the private sector balance. And so it becomes pretty obvious that an increase in investment and debt or an increase in net income flows reduces the private sector balance. So this number here, the 11.5 billion, is an incredible amount of money to be leaving Scotland every year, which is directly reducing the private sector balance in Scotland. So in order to get, if we scroll down again to the balances, in order to get these blue balances higher, a good way to start would be to, combat the foreign ownership in Scotland's economy, to stop this 11.5 billion on average leaving the Scottish economy every year, and trying to make sure that as much as that is possible stays in the private sector, which would see these blue balances go up.
Absolutely. And again, I think it's really important to highlight that this shows us this is more of a concern for Scotland right now, because it doesn't control the public sector deficit. Now, because we have to rely on Westminster for that red bar, it means that it's really difficult for us to grow that blue bar, because the money's leaving to the external sector. Now, however, if Scotland was independent and we were able to run a 12-15% deficit because there was a demand for Scottish-based assets, financial assets, then that would be fine. But the big difference is that right now, and when you look at the sectorial balances, you can clearly see that the public sector money is in effect disappearing abroad. It's not providing Scots with any net financial savings. So big worry. But I think that's important. It's when you look at this from a currency user and a currency issuer, it is very different. Now, I'll just finish with, certainly there's an issue around ownership and who's taking rents out of Scottish assets. But that's much more about power than it is about the impact it has on the financial flows. And I think it's really important that you target that as a way to make sure that Scottish assets are in Scottish hands rather than in foreign hands. But it's not a significant issue if you have your own currency and you're able to balance that. Loads of nations operate on big foreign sector surpluses in this case, or deficits for the country.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, if you just want to relate it to current events, the First Minister, John Swinney, in the US, trying to get better tariffs for Scottish whisky. With the Scottish whisky industry being largely foreign owned, better tariffs or lower tariffs would only really lead to this green bar increasing.
Yeah, and it's around 70%.
Yeah, instead of the blue bar. Yeah.
And that is, sorry, so you're absolutely right. We need to look at the industries that are raising the blue section and not the green section. So GDP could increase with more export sales, but that wouldn't impact the private sector wealth, because 70% of that at least is going abroad. So I think that is really important. And this just highlights how useful sectorial balances are. It allows us to have these conversations that other frameworks don't allow us to do.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, will we have a look at the other two scenarios that we covered?
Yeah, so if we go here to scenario 2, here we go. If I just scroll to the end, you'll see the growth rates are 1.01, which is 1% growth rate for all our variables. And if I scroll back to the beginning, now the balances, the percentage balances pretty much look the same, with around 12% public sector deficit, around 5% private sector surplus, and around a 7.5% foreign sector surplus. But the actual nominal values are significantly different because the economy is growing at a lower rate. So a 1% growth rate, GDP in 2041 is 276 billion. If we go back to scenario 1, GDP in 2041 is 297 billion at a 1.4% rate.
So that's almost, let me just quickly do the maths here. 27. That's almost
pretty much 21 billion.
Yeah. So almost 10% bigger if the growth rate's 1% compared to 1.4%. So it doesn't seem like that much of a difference, but it has a significant impact on the GDP. And again, it's probably worth saying we hated using GDP as the reference point here because this has no bearing on the well-being of people in Scotland, but it's the figure that the Stability and Growth Pact is based on. So we had to kind of use that framework. We have to talk about GDP, but we hope by breaking it down and saying, actually, if you want to look at GDP, the most important part to look at is the private sector net worth. And that's where you focus, and that's where you get the use of GDP. But as you said, it's really clear GDP is still going up, but it's a lesser an extent if we use the 1%, which, as I said at the start, I think is still a fairly unrealistic scenario for us to look at. But we were trying to be as positive as we could in this analysis. Anything else you want to see on scenario 2?
No, that's basically it. The percentage balances pretty much look the same, but it's the nominal balances. So the GDP here, the government deficit nominally is a little bit less, which is here. The private sector surplus is a little bit less, which is here. So the private sector surplus here is 12.5 billion in 2041. And here in scenario 1 at 1.4% growth rate, it's 13.6. So, £1 billion less being injected into the private sector at the 1% growth rate compared to 1%.
Each year, each year, obviously, over that cumulative period as well.
Exactly.
Okay, great. Our third scenario was our least least favourable, but I think realistically probably where we will end up for the period of growth this year. So we looked at, in the third scenario, was 0% growth, wasn't it?
Yeah, which is basically, you can see here, it's 1. We've just got a constant 1 all the way through because there's 0% growth, as you said. So if we scroll back,
and not 0, because 0 gives you nothing. 1 gives you the factor that you can that changes everything else. There has to be something in there. You can't put 0. Yeah, okay.
So you can see the GDP pretty much balances out to just a constant of 200 and just shy of 230 billion. And again, that compared to the 1.4% scenario where it was 297 billion.
297, which of course that's what's going to happen because that's designed into the model. We've said there's no GDP growth. So if you look at the column that says GDP, there's no growth. So this is based. This is how the model works. But the really important thing is to look across this and say nothing changes at this period of time. You can see how when the economy doesn't grow, you can see the even bigger challenge of the government moving from a 12% deficit to a 9, 6, and then eventually to a 3% deficit.
Correct, yeah. And again, just the private sector balance here is 10.5 billion. Again, compare that to the 12.5 billion under 1% and the 13.5 billion under 1.4%. And again, the percentage balances pretty much look the same, but it's the nominal differences that you're looking at in these columns here.
Okay, fantastic. And scroll along. I take it for this one, we said if there's if there's no growth
Mm-hmm.
in government spending, then there would be just all the way along to the end to the yellow bits.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we've said there's no growth in government spending, so there's no growth in consumption.
Yes.
But what's likely to happen is without any growth in government expenditure, consumption's likely to fall, not stay at zero, it's likely to fall. Our export might, or our exports might fall, our imports might rise, but it's unlikely because of the multiplier effect in government spending that these things wouldn't be smaller than they actually are. And just to highlight again, what we tried to do, because we thought it was a bad idea for Scotland to try and move to the 3% public deficit, was to say, well, let's look at the best case scenario. And this is common for researchers to do this. If you've got a point to make, you kind of want to give the opposition the benefit of the doubt. And that's what we did by looking at 1.4%, everything only reducing by a certain amount if we move from X% of government spending down to another, which is what we do in the paper. So we really tried to give this stability and growth pact idea a fair crack of the whip, didn't we?
Yeah, we did.
Okay. All right. So hopefully people who are ready to look at the model, they've got a clear idea of how you make it. And again, it's important that all these figures are taken from the calculations. It's only the growth rates that you're able to play about with of the government spending, imports, exports, consumption to find out where we end up. But if you change those, you scroll across and then you can see what the public sector deficit is, what the private sector deficit, and what the foreign sector is. So you can play about with this, and maybe you think actually because of, I don't know, AI productivity, that in 2026 GDP actually might be 1.5. So you could put that in and you could say that might lead to more imports or more exports or more consumption. You can play with these and then you can move along and you can see what impact. But my big challenge to anyone who's watching and anyone who uses this model is to play about with that in some form of realistic reality and try and see if you can get our sectorial balances with the public sector under 3% whilst you've got the private sector net saving, because that's the challenge that we said would be almost impossible, and certainly impossible based on any of the growth scenarios that we used. But hey, 2% growth, everything looks fairly peachy, but that seems so far away from where we're likely to be over the foreseeable future.
Yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic. Yep, go on.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say the last thing is, in order to get, like you were touching on, down to those 3% deficits, if you don't want the government to cut expenditure, which is essentially saying you do not want austerity, then your only two real areas are reducing, increasing exports and increasing investment. And again, you can play around with things here, but if you were to, instead of exports growing at 1%, if they were to grow at 2.5%, and it's important to note here that I actually looked at the growth rates of exports, including offshore activity, over the last 25 years, and the average growth rate is under 2%. So to 2.5% is already, a super optimistic growth rate. But to say that it's going to grow at 2.5% every year, if you were to scroll it down, so it was a 2.5% growth rate every year, with all the other variables staying the same, then you would only get, over the next 15 years, you still wouldn't get down to a 3% public sector deficit. You can see the public sector deficit here in 2041, it gets down to 4.8%.
Wow.
And this is with exports growing at 2.5% every year, and imports staying the same, and government spending staying the same. So I think it just highlights that in order to reach the 3% deficit that the Scottish Government would be pursuing under the Stability and Growth Pact, it would require, fantasy levels of export, essentially.
Well, that's fascinating because you've got
fantasy levels of investment growth, which would lead to, private sector debt bubbles and. and the carnage with that. So I think essentially, which I guess most of the audience know, pursuing small deficits almost always results in austerity, and there's very few pathways to prevent austerity if you're pursuing small deficits.
Yeah, fantastic. You've not shown me this before, so thank you so much. That's fascinating. Go and show me that graph again. On the fantasy. Can you call this the fantasy growth scenario?
Yeah, I think Dirk called it the Chinese consumer market become lovers of Scottish whiskey.
Yeah. But including their kids, including the under 18s.
Yes.
Well, I mean, that is really important, because I think that, when we've got a meeting to show this to the Scottish Government next month, and within the paper, if you do read the paper, you'll see that there's a very small section, but we've said, yeah, but what if? And one of the what ifs is actually if GDP grows for some remarkable reason. Maybe there's a massive gold deposit discovered under Dundee, right? And that increases our exports and our growth and our GDP by 2.5%, right? Something incredible happens, and maybe this all just looks away, because it's just worth explaining. As your economy grows, then if all other things being equal, the amount that makes up your 3% shrinks. So if it's 3% of a 100 billion economy, if it stays at 60 billion and the economy doubles, that goes down to 1.5%. So the size of the economy does impact the percentage if it's fixed in terms of your public deficit. So growth definitely helps, but as you've highlighted, 2.5% would be miraculous. And when you said you looked at the growth of exports over the last couple of decades, you'll see that it's a declining. We'd have to reverse this trend first of all before we started it shooting up. It's not like it's going up slowly and we just increase it. We actually need to reverse it, which again makes it incredibly difficult. And what this also highlights is that if we attract more foreign direct investment, which is part of the plan, and another thing we look at in the book, in the report, then it's likely that the increase in foreign direct investment, all that would do, it might raise GDP a little bit, but what you would see in the sectorial balances is the green bar getting bigger. So the only way that could be replaced would be shrinking the private sector or increasing the public sector, which is the exact opposite of what they're trying to do with the Stability and Growth Pact. So what we really tried to hope, and I hope you can get that now watching those 3 episodes, is that it's impossible for the Scottish Government to achieve the Stability and Growth Pact. And it really makes us question why they have said this. And I think that's the most important thing. Why have they said this? And then secondly, how have they justified this to the people that they're getting out to speak about this? Or how have they justified having this as part of the 22? Where's the workings? Where's the evidence base that says that this is all achievable? Because I think with your help, Kieran, and obviously the work that Dirk and I have done, we've got something that the Scottish Government has to look at and say, that's wrong because A, B, C, and D. And that's what we're going to be pushing, because we think that not just independence voters, but everyone who might end up living in Scottish and independent Scotland needs to know that all these things have been thought about and worked out. That's my main takeaways. You were heavily involved in the report as well. What's your one takeaway that you'd like the audience to think about?
I think that is the one takeaway, and I'm sure you bang on about this all the time, but public sector deficits are not only not a concern, but are good and necessary in order for your private sector to be flourishing and to be for citizens like you and me to be saving money at the end of the month and not going into more debt. I think that is the number one takeaway. And if that's the one thing that the Scottish Government or ministers could understand, is public sector deficits, whether it is now or whether it's in an independent Scotland, especially in an independent Scotland with their own currency, are not only are they not a bad thing or a concern, but they're actually a good thing. That would be the number one.
Okay, fantastic. Right, well, I've got one technical question for you before you go then, Ben. We'll see if we can get a quick answer to this. So just to check my understanding, you've got 6 flows to and from each of the 3 sectors in total. And the main sectorial balances graph shows the net flows from each sector for any given year. I think the answer to that is yes, but Kieran, is that yes?
It is, yes. The sectorial balances are made up of 6 flows. So the red bar is the difference between government expenditure and tax revenue. The blue bar is the difference between private sector saving and investment. And the green bar is the difference between exports and imports. Because of the complexities in the Scottish data and the Scottish accounts, and in order to solidify this model, we did add other columns like the transfers, but the transfers go into the government expenditure, which is the red bar, and the net income flows, the column which we added, essentially counts as imports because we are sending money abroad. So that goes into the green bar. So essentially there are 6 flows, but we've made certain modern decisions to come up with more accurate balances for those sectors. But yeah.
Great. All right, brilliant. Thanks for that, Ben. Please do it. Anyone who's using the model, do drop a note in the comments or the kind of show notes beneath us to see if you've had a play and what outcomes you'll do. We might do one of these a little bit later in the year where we actually look at some of the other scenarios. Maybe we'll look at one, Kieran, and we'll say, well, what's 1% growth reduction in government expenditure? What impact does that have? But let's not just do -1%. Let's just do -1.1% because consumption will fall, and we'll try and build it to make it as kind of realistic as possible. But the key for us to say is that almost nothing that we can do makes it in any way achievable to have this 3% target for the public sector deficit, which is what our paper was all about. Kieran, thanks so much for joining us, and again for doing all the work to support us on this. You're not finished yet. We'll make sure we do a wee bit more with this model next year. Maybe we'll even put the updated figures in once we've got them, maybe at the start of the year.
Absolutely, yeah. No, it was my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Brilliant. Thanks so much. Cheers, everyone. Do play the model, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks. We've been quite detailed look at the paper, so we'll have a few weeks off, and then we'll be back with another episode. Thanks so much. Bye for now. If you're enjoying this episode of the Scottonomics podcast, please consider joining us on Patreon with a paid subscription for as little as £3 per month. Your support will ensure we can continue to create this podcast. Find the link in the show notes or head over to patreon.com/Scottonomics. Also, please do like, share, and comment on this podcast.